Welcome, everyone. Welcome back to the show. It's your host, Danny Dhaiphong. And as you can see, I am joined by two big friends of the show, Scott Ritter, former UN Weapons Inspector, U.S. Marine Corps Intelligence Officer, and Ray McGovern, ex-CIA analyst. And both of them geopolitical commentators, analysts, and journalists in their own right. Gentlemen, good to have you back.
Thanks, Danny.
Of course. And damn good ones, might I add, in terms of geopolitical analysts. So hit that like button because that will make sure their voices are heard far and wide. But gentlemen, let's get started. I wanted to talk to you about Europe not taking the coming, rolling, and ongoing defeat in Ukraine very well, and its threats of war appear to be backfiring really hard, as Putin calls Europe's bluff. Now, in some of his strongest words that we've heard, Vladimir Putin, before the U.S.-Russia talks, had a lot to say about Europe's war threats. I wanted to play a comment that is not being talked about as much. Many are talking about how he said Russia's ready for war if Europe starts one, but here's another comment that isn't getting as much attention.
Warmongers, even when they are trying allegedly to introduce some changes, some adjustments to the President Trump's proposal, all these changes have only one goal in mind. They are aimed at blocking and putting to a halt this peace process. They are trying to make demands that are unacceptable for Russia, and they understand this, and then later they would try to blame Russia, accuse Russia of stopping this peace process. This is their objectives, and we can clearly see that. That's why, well, if they want to go back to the reality, considering the reality on the ground, then they are welcome. We are not against this.
So, Scott, we begin with you. You know, there's an Italian admiral within NATO saying they're preparing for a preemptive attack on Russia. What's going on here? What's your assessment of the situation, as it appears the Ukraine situation is causing Europe to go suicidal?
Well, it's just that. I mean, first of all, I think let's just take everything with a grain of salt. NATO is a consensus-driven organization. Last time I checked, the United States and Hungary were members of NATO. And the notion that this mustachioed Italian admiral who's on the military committee is the man who makes these decisions is ludicrous. This is just the stupidity of a system that is coming face to face with the reality that they are losing their relevance, that they no longer matter. They don't factor in at all. Nobody takes them seriously anymore. They're not even invited to the table. They're not invited to come and bow before Trump as they did after Alaska. They're just nothing. And so, having been ignored, like most children, they will throw temper tantrums and say things. But if you carefully parse what he said, he immediately nullifies everything. You know, of course, there will be some legal problems. Yeah, like you're not going to be able to do it. And there's some political problems, questions of who would do this and who would approve it. Nobody's going to do it and nobody's going to approve it. So again, the stupidity of the man, all he did is create an environment where the United States once again will reiterate the new reality that Article 5 no longer exists, that the United States will not go to war for Europe. Even Scott Bessent recently has said if Russia attacks Europe, the United States, the best we'll do is sell Europe weapons. But the idea that Americans are going to fight and die for Europe is that ship has sailed. And Russia, of course, isn't going to attack Europe unless Europe attacks Russia, which, you know, Putin has made it very clear that that would be the end of Europe as Europe currently exists. And he wasn't threatening nuclear weapons. I just want to remind people that there's a little factory outside of Kazan that's been producing 1,000 geranium drones, Geranium 2s and 3s, the most updated versions a day. And that Russia might use several hundred of these a day. Where do you think the ones that aren't being used are what's happening to them? They're part of a strategic reserve. Europe today has no air defense. They've stripped themselves totally bare to send it to Ukraine. Marco Rubio gave away the hard truth when he said, yeah, we'll send 2 or 3 Patriot systems to Ukraine, and within a week they're all destroyed because Russia hunts them down and kills them. So Europe is totally naked. There is no air defense, and Russia has the means to eliminate Europe as a viable economic, industrial entity overnight. And that's the point Putin made. If you want to do this, then we will do it, but you will cease to exist right now because we're ready right now. No mobilization. He doesn't have to go to the parliament. He doesn't have to mobilize 100,000 troops. They are ready right now with the conventional capacity to eliminate NATO instantaneously with no nuclear weapons. And there's nothing NATO can do about it. So this is the reality. And the Italian general is just, reflecting the impotence felt by Europe. But you see the same impotence in the phone calls that are held by the European leaders where they complain about how America's abandoned them. Well, an interesting thing about that phone call is that nobody in the United States cares. I mean, the media may publish that transcript and people like Ray and I will read them with great interest. But if you think for a second that changed the needle in the White House, that Donald Trump went, oh, God, Starmer's mad at me. Oh, no, Mertz is concerned. Trump doesn't care. That ship, too, has sailed. If you don't know what happened in Moscow the other day, it is the total irrelevance of the former system of geopolitical interaction. Marco Rubio is no longer a player. Lavrov isn't a player, not because Russia's sidelined him, but he needs a counterpart. And with Rubio off the table, because Rubio took himself out. There was a famous phone call, we don't know the exact transcript of which, between Lavrov and Rubio, where Lavrov apparently read him the Riot Act and said, you are the dumbest man to walk the face of the earth. We handed you peace on a platter in Alaska, and you have fumbled it because you've listened to Kellogg and other idiots like this. And he laid it out. We don't know what the transcript says. Trump does, and Rubio was sidelined at that point in time. And that's when Trump made the decision that he's going to take this process into his own hands. That's why the people that sat down with Vladimir Putin were named Jared Kushner, the closest personal advisor to Donald Trump you can get, a man who just call him father-in-law, not Mr. President. That's how close they are. And Steve Witkoff, a close personal friend who was meeting with Kirill Dmitriev, who Witkoff and Dmitriev have come up to with a global understanding of what the world will look like economically. And Trump seems to have bought into that. And Kushner and Ushakov's job, Ushakov being the close advisor to President Putin on foreign policy issues, their job is to ride herd on this, to keep it moving in the right direction. Don't allow it to get the cart get upset. And that's where we're at right now. This is it's all over for Europe. They just don't matter. Nobody cares anymore. Nobody.
Ray, your take.
Well, it's a pretty bleak situation if I'm a European and I'm looking out at these things. The Germans have a little expression, ein bisschen Spaß darf sein. A little levity is sometimes okay. So let me tell you about the secret weapon that the Italians have and that the Italian general is not at liberty to disclose. It's a new battle tank with 5 gears, mind you, really swift. You know this probably won't. Okay. Four reverse gears and 1 forward in case of an attack from the rear.
That's right.
I make a joke. Now, even Putin makes jokes. And in talking to the Indians just now this afternoon, he said, spending 5 hours with Jared Kushner and Witkoff, I mean, that's too much. That's just too much. But we had to do it because they came in with all these points and we had to go through each one of them. And then Putin said, okay, now let me be serious, okay? It was a very productive conversation. So this is now just 2 hours ago, okay? It was based on prior agreements before the meeting with Trump in Alaska. Or the prior agreements, 2 things. Mr. Trump, forget about an immediate ceasefire, which Trump did 2 hours later. And then, Mr. Trump, don't let the Ukrainians and the Europeans put the kibosh on it to sabotage progress forward, which, as Scott just told us, they didn't do. Rubio just fumbled the ball. They didn't do that. And now they're doing it. Here, just further with respect to very, very briefly, yeah, this was a new proposal, says Putin. So we had to go through practically every point, which is why it took 5 hours. So it was a meaningful, highly specific, and substantive conversation. Another thing he said here, which is really interesting, he says, I believe Trump really wants to do this. He really wants to have peace in Ukraine, partly because he wants to stop the killing, partly for other reasons, which we won't go into. But then he says he's sincerely trying to do this, but he's got all this conflicting advice he's got here. And so, it's really to his credit, says Putin, that Trump is going ahead anyway. And this seems to be a kind of a break. This time it looks like they may not be Trumpian zigzags, that maybe will achieve things, the more so since we've marginalized the Europeans, we've marginalized the Ukrainians, and it's a pas de deux. Okay, we're dealing one-on-one, and not a ménage à trois where you have the Ukrainians and the Europeans in on the act. So what I just want to say that one earnest of how serious this is that Putin says, look, you're asking me to spell out what we agreed to. No, we're not going to do this. This time we're going to keep this confidential. We're going to, it's premature to talk about, the specifics. And indeed, wonder of wonders, Trump yesterday restrained himself. He said, well, I'll tell you this, it takes two to tango. The hell does that mean? Anyhow, he's not doing the loudspeaker stuff that Lavrov and others have been so critical of. So what's my prognosis? I think Putin really believes Trump is serious, that he's got real problems, that Putin is winning, so there's no great time pressure on him. But Putin says there seems to be some time pressure on Trump. I think he wants to stop the killing, yes, but I think there may be other things. And, my trite suggestion the other week that the Nobel Peace Prize nominations close on the 31st of January for this coming year, I have to believe that that's partly in Trump's calculation. I mean, Gaza forget about it. Were he able to do something on Ukraine with Putin, that would qualify. And do I begrudge him that? No, have a peace prize if there's going to be peace. I mean, it's a self-aggrandizement type of motive, but hell, if it brings a cessation of these terrible wars, so much the better.
Yeah. Well, Scott, how can then Europe, given that the trajectory of the conflict for the Trump administration is to, at the very least, pause it, stop this? How can Europe sabotage it? Because you said yourself that Russia has all the means and capabilities if it really wants to try something with Russia to annihilate Europe. So how can Europe sabotage this process?
They can't. It's over. It's finished. I mean, look at their last gasp effort right now was to get Belgium to cave in on Euroclear and allow Europe to seize $150 billion worth of Russian frozen assets to transfer them to Ukraine, who needs it right now because the Rada is trying to come up with a budget. They're supposed to come up with a budget. They need 160 billion euros. They don't have it. Ukraine's economy can't generate it. They need 160 billion euros, and if they don't get this money from the stolen Russian assets, then Europe's on the hook because America's not stepping in. Europe doesn't have it. Nobody's going. This is the end of Ukraine. Just so people understand it, it's over. There's nothing left. They can't afford to do this. Europe can't afford to pay it. And nobody's talking. Nobody cares about Europe. It's not as though Trump's calling up Macron saying, hey, Emmanuel, remember that nice gathering we had in Paris a couple of years ago in my first term where I held your hand and we looked longingly in each other's eyes with the Eiffel Tower looming in the background? I'm really interested in what you think about this gig I got going on in Ukraine. Trump's not making that call. And the French are furious. The Germans are furious. The British are furious because they don't matter. They're irrelevant. They can talk to each other, but Kushner and Witkoff didn't stop in Europe to sound things out. They just came back to talk to them. And the most important thing that people have to understand is not only can Europe not sabotage this because Trump's not giving them the opportunity and they don't have the wherewithal to do anything on their own volition, Trump, I believe, is engaged in an active process of controlling this mechanism through the manipulation of the corruption investigation. This corruption investigation that's taking place, understand that the United States has known forever that Ukraine is the most corrupt place on the planet. It's not a secret. We encourage this corruption. This is why Rand Paul's idea of an inspector general was shot down in 2022, because we said, no, we know they're corrupt by getting them addicted to the American dollar, the American largesse. We manage this corruption so we are in total control of this situation politically. And now what's happening today is for Russia to get what it wants, understand there's some difficult things there that Europe would never allow. Denazification. Europe would never allow that. Demilitarization. Europe's already said, no, they have to have 800,000 troops. Ukraine will finish this war with 50 to 60,000 troops, none of which will be NATO trained. That's the reality. But how do we get there? You can't do this with the current governmental structures in Ukraine. So they have to be eliminated. And you have to be careful how you eliminate them so it doesn't appear that you're totally doing Russia's bidding, which in fact we are. Because Russia says denazification must take place. So we have to create the conditions that make that conducive. Demilitarization has to take place. Europe can't be involved. So what has to be involved? We have to collapse the Ukrainian government. And that's what we're doing right now. We eliminated what part of there's three big poles there. There's the presidency, the office of the presidential administration, which doesn't work for the president. I don't know if you guys have seen the video of Yermak summoning Zelensky over. It's a totally separate office, totally different power structure. And Zelensky, of course, is concerned about Yermak because Yermak controls the oligarchs and controls a huge mechanism of corruption. But there's also the Rada. The Rada passes a budget that's approved by the president, and the president allocates money that goes into the pockets of the parliamentarians who feeds their different corrupt constituencies. Ukraine is the single most corrupt place on the planet. The United States just took out Yermak. We took out Yermak. Nobody else. We did. And now we're going to take out the Rada, and we're going to collapse that structure. And that creates now the new reality. And then in the end, we're going to take out Zelensky once Zelensky signs off on the termination of the war on our terms. And then Russia will step in through the election process and rebuild a Ukrainian government that will do exactly what Russia wants it to do. This is the end game. This is the only way it ends. It doesn't end with the Ukrainian government leaning towards Europe and listening to Europe. It ends with the Ukrainian government 100% in the pocket of Russia, with the United States doing an indirect security guarantees through economic engagement through the Russian vehicle. This is where we're at right now. And this has been the Russian intent all along. I think Trump finally woke up to the fact that this is the way it has to be. Because, look, I'll just leave it here. There's strategic thinking at play here. All the idiots who talk about decapitation are idiots. If you start decapitating Ukraine, where do you go? Russia knows that you don't end this conflict until the world recognizes Russian sovereign control over Crimea and the four territories. You don't get that by decapitating Kiev. You don't get that by occupying Odessa. You get that by conflict termination on terms that say we recognize Russia's sovereign control in perpetuity over Crimea and these four territories. And you end economic sanctions. How does Russia fully integrate into the global economy if sanctions are still linked to Russia's illegal occupation? And of course, the return of Russians' frozen assets. These are three critical things that need to happen for Russia to move forward and succeed, to go from 4.8% growth to 7%, 8% growth, 10%, 12%. The Russian economy can explode in growth if all these conditions are met. And this is the strategic vision of a Vladimir Putin that some people seem to be totally ignorant of. He's not looking for military victory. He's looking for political victory, economic victory, geopolitical victory. And so is Donald Trump. Donald Trump is not going to get bogged down in a European war. He's not going to commit national suicide on behalf of failed European states. Trump is looking for trillions of dollars of economic gain through interaction with Russia in a post-conflict environment. This is the strategic vector that's taking place right now. And it's a beautiful thing to watch, because Europe has just proven its irrelevancy, proven that it's incompatible with civilized existence. And I am thrilled to death to see Europe collapse on its own volition and watch NATO disappear into the trash heap of history.
Yeah, right. Certainly take it away on anything you want to go off of.
Well, need I say I agree with Scott? Well, if I need to, yeah, I think he's right on. Let me flesh out some of the little particulars, so to speak. With respect to informing or dissing, that is, uninforming the Ukrainians or the Europeans, it was really interesting. As Scott has indicated, he and I, who are serious students of Russia and Soviet Union, we read everything. We read the whole transcript from Ushakov 2 days ago, okay? So what did he say at the end? So he says, well, he's got a question. Where's Witkoff now? It's 12:30 in the morning. Where is he? My understanding. Now, bear in mind, Ushakov is no neophyte. 10 years as ambassador to the United States, okay, 1998 to 2008. Since 2012, first aid to Putin on such matters as Ukraine. So he says in his diplomatic, well, my understanding is that Witkoff's gone back to the U.S. Embassy. Question, is he not going to inform the Ukrainians? They have invited him to Kiev. Is he not going to stop there? And Ushakov, as diplomatically as he could, says, no, actually, it's Abishali. They promised us not to do that. They promised us, Abishat is a pretty strong word in Russian. They promised us to go directly home, do not pass Kiev, do not pass Dublin, go directly home, do not collect $200. So, here is Ushakov saying, look, Witkoff and Witkoff and son, I call it, of course, he's son-in-law, not Witkoff. Anyhow, Witkoff and son told us, okay, we promise we're going to snub the Ukrainians. We're not going to stop there. We know that Zelensky is pining for us to put down in Shannon and have a Guinness with him and tell him what it was. We're not going to do that either. And sure enough, what's happened today, as I understand it, a Ukrainian delegation headed by Umerov is in Miami now talking to whom? Rubio? No, Witkoff and Jared Kushner. So that's one thing. The other thing with respect to NATO, and this is unprecedented. Now, I've been around longer than Scott even. I go back to the early 60s as an analyst of Soviet affairs, and that's just not too long after NATO was established. NATO's chief aim was to keep the United States in Europe. Okay. There were two other parts, but what counts now, keep them in Europe. Well, guess what? United States is not in NATO anymore. And the proof of that, the graphic proof, is that they had a ministerial foreign ministers meeting twice a year yesterday in Brussels. And let me just read to you the artful way that NBC portrayed the proceedings. One sentence, quote, almost all of NATO's foreign ministers gathered in Brussels on Wednesday to blah, 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 blah. Almost all of the NATO's foreign. Oh my God. Who wasn't there? Rubio was a no-show. Did he have other business? No. He didn't deign to explain the reason he wasn't going to the NATO Foreign Ministry Summit. That's the first time in those many decades that I've seen this happen, except maybe for a war when Colin Powell wouldn't go. So, this is you couldn't have a better symbol than this. And the U.S. is out of there. Okay, NATO, I hate to say it, he's a paper tiger, but without the U.S., maybe Scott would agree, is nothing. NATO is nothing without the United States. And here's Trump saying, "Look, Whitcomb, you come right home, and you know you promised the Russians you wouldn't stop in Kiev or anywhere else." And sure enough, then when Trump says, "Okay, now come on, you can come to us here in Miami again, and we'll read you the riot act, or we'll tell you what's going on." I see progress really hastening now. Every other day, Putin or Lavrov or somebody makes a big, Ushakov makes a big statement. And it's interesting that Putin today says, Trump seems to be in a big hurry. We don't know exactly why we think he doesn't want more people to be killed. And I'll just say one more time, and you can laugh if you like, but this guy is a narcissist, and he has his eye on a Nobel Prize. He mentioned it. He mentioned it at the cabinet meeting 2 days ago. He's renamed the Institute of Peace to Donald J. Trump Institute of Peace, as the Washington Post says today. So there is this narcissism, and Putin is smart enough to know how you deal with a narcissist. You don't alienate them. You say pleasant things, and then make sure that you're the stronger party. That's the way it's going down, as I see it.
Yeah, well, I think all of your observations, both of you, are very astute here. And now I want to include and factor in the battlefield if we can, because Ushakov himself has said after the meeting that battlefield progress is a big reason for why there is all of this other kinds of progress around the conflict. And I wanted to actually play what Vladimir Putin, it seems like lately, Scott, anything Vladimir Putin says is scaring the bejesus out of the Western mainstream media. And here he is in India talking about Russia's goals and where it's going on the battlefield.
Listen, for 8 years we did not recognize the self-declared republics. For 8 years, they have declared their independence, and we were trying to build relations between the rest of Ukraine and these republics. When we understood that it's impossible, that they're simply being destroyed, we were forced to recognize them, and not simply recognize them as their partial territory, but within the administrative borders, when they existed back in the Soviet times. And later, during the times of the independent Ukraine, after it gained independence, in the administrative limits, lines. So the people, the voters, came to the referendum and voted for everyone to withdraw troops from there and not to conduct any armed actions there. But they preferred to wage war. And now it all came to a head. And it all comes to one thing. Either we do that through military action, we'll liberate the territories, or the Ukrainian troops will withdraw and leave these territories and stop killing people there.
Scott, your reaction, man, India Today, that's a lot of flashy advertising there. But Scott, your commentary on the battlefield, what is happening and where do these comments factor in? Because the Western mainstream media is now freaking out about Putin promising to liberate the territories east of Ukraine. Your thoughts?
Look, in 2023, after the failed Ukrainian summer counteroffensive, I said that the war is over. Now, I pointed out that just like in World War II, the Battle of Kursk marked the turning point, but there's still a lot of fighting left to be done. And, the death of Ukraine would take some time. But when you look at military algorithms, and that's what I did for a living, the fact of the matter is Russia had mastered the algorithm of attrition. That Russian defense industry was outpacing NATO and American ability to resupply Ukraine, and the Russian military was killing Ukrainians at a rate quicker than Ukraine could replace them, and the Russian military was growing, not shrinking. And that basically military math dictated an outcome there. Russia would get Ukraine to the point where it can no longer sustain cohesive defensive structures along the totality of the line of conflict, and you would start to see a collapse. Well, we've reached that point. Okay, we can now safely say that we have reached the point where Ukraine has run out of troops, and they literally gaps are appearing in the Ukrainian defensive lines that can't be plugged. There's nobody to plug them with. They've lost too many irreplaceable troops, too much command and control, too much equipment. It can't be replaced. Russia is getting stronger. Ukraine's getting weaker. But Ukraine before used to be able to, throw in troops to plug a hole, and Russia just had to grind them down. And now we're at the point where there's no troops left to plug a hole. Russia's ground them down, and you're starting to see Russia make more impressive gains. They seized more territory last week than they did in the entire month before. And I think you're going to see going forward, Russia will be taking more and more territory. We're looking at potential total collapse of the Zaporizhia front, which will be disastrous for the Ukrainians because that'll allow Russia to roll right up the Dnieper River, get across the Dnieper River, pivot south, and take the right bank of Kherson, threaten Mykolaiv and Odessa in the process. And there's no Ukrainian defenses there. The same thing right now in Donetsk. If the Zaporizhia front collapses, Russia pivots north, and now you're looking at a major pincer coming out of Kharkov, out of the Kharkov region, south, and the Ukrainians will have no choice but to evacuate the totality of the Donbass or lose everybody. And if somehow they manage to stabilize the front, still they're dying a death of 1,000 cuts. The 25th Brigade, the 38th Marine Brigade, two of Ukraine's best brigades, are surrounded south of Pokrovsk. They're not getting out of it. They're going to die. The Ukrainian government has abandoned these troops. They've asked for permission to evacuate. The Ukrainian government won't let them evacuate. They're out of food. They're out of ammunition. They're out of fuel. And now they're going to die. These orders have been made public. It's widespread discussed in the Ukrainian media. And now you have territorial brigade commanders saying if they abandon their two best brigades, what are they going to do to us? Ukrainian soldiers are refusing now to fight and die. Desertion rates are at a record high. We just see cases where entire battalions and brigades leave the battlefield because they don't want to be surrounded. This is what's happened in Zaporizhia. And so it's over. I mean, they're still fighting. I remind people that the bloodiest month of World War II for American forces in Europe wasn't June, D-Day, going across the beach in Normandy. It wasn't the Battle of the Bulge. It wasn't Aachen or Hurtgen Forest. It was April 1945, the last full month of the war, where the German army was defeated. The German army fought hard, and America lost more troops that month than we lost in any other month in the European theater. So there's still a lot of hard fighting left. But the Russians have mastered the tactic. This is the other thing people don't understand. The Russian army that's fighting today is not the Russian army that started this conflict in 2022. It's a completely different Russian army from top to bottom. Everything about it has changed. The way they fight, with the weapons they fight, the doctrine that they fight with, how they're supported logistically, their command and control relationships, everything fundamentally changed. The Russian army today is finely tuned for the reality of large-scale ground combat, and they're able to sustain this model successfully. All this crap you hear about Russian meat grinder assaults, the infantry waves coming in, it doesn't work that way, guys. The Russians come in, 3 6s and 9s. Sometimes they'll move 15 guys, but drone warfare dictates that you don't do those kind of open field assaults. Do they get caught out? Yeah, I was just in Russia, and while I was there was a specific unit that I had been in contact with through an intermediary, a Storm Z unit, the assault unit, that had a history of successful assaults. They got caught out. 15 guys got in a bad situation. They got hit by Ukrainian drones. Half of them were killed. The other half were wounded. In order to self-evacuate, because the Ukrainian drones were causing a huge problem, a seriously burned guy had to walk 20 kilometers on his own to get to a point where he could be evacuated to medical assistance. He's now in the hospital getting treatment, and he'll live. But it was a bad day for Russian troops. The Russian troops do have bad days, but that's happens rarely on the battlefield. What happened after that? The Russians stabilized the front, threw in their drone capabilities, pushed the Ukrainian drones out, achieved drone dominance, and killed all the Ukrainian drone operators and continued their advance. This is the reality. Ukraine has localized successes, counterattacks, etc., but they don't achieve any operational or strategic advantage for Ukraine. It buys them time. for their inevitable death. The casualty ratios on the battlefield are unrealistically high in favor of Russia. What I mean by unrealistically, when you look at the numbers, the reality of these numbers, you say that's impossible to achieve. How can Russia advance? Normally, that's a 3-to-1 advantage you need to have. The Russians are attacking, not with 3-to-1 advantages, and the casualties they're achieving right now, 15, 20, 30-to-1. That means they're killing 15 to 20 to 30 Ukrainians for every Russian that dies. That's the reality. That's the reality that Donald Trump has woken up to, by the way. He used to think that the Russians were taking a lot of casualties because Keith Kellego's telling him this nonsense. It's not happening. The Russians are losing men. It's a tough war. The Ukrainians are tough fighters. But the Russians have total dominance right now. Even in drones, I had a fascinating dinner with a Russian frontline drone commander, and I said, who's better at drone warfare, Russia or Ukraine? He said, Ukraine's really good. They're really good. And they tactically and operationally, they might have a slight advantage over us. He said, but they can't sustain it. They'll come in and they'll achieve an objective for a day or two, but then we just come in with overwhelming force. And he said, the other thing he said is, we're getting better. We're as good as they are in most places, and getting better than they are in some places. But he says, we'll have total drone dominance. The Ukrainians won't stand a chance because we've mastered this. We just now did make it a systemic mastery. And that's the difference between Russia and all the other forces out there. The Russians have adapted to this reality. They have learned their lessons. They have gone in, they've taken it up to the general staff. They've invented new doctrine. They take it down to the training. The Russian forces, the Ukrainian forces are stuck on the battlefield. They're stuck in the trenches. They die, they surrender, they get killed. The Russians attack, and then they get rotated out. They get rotated home. They can be with their families. Their morale's high. And then they get rotated to a training center where they're updated with the most recent tactics that are derived from the reality. It takes the Russians a matter of days or weeks to learn a lesson, get it up, get a doctrinally approved day on the training center, and then off to the battlefield. They've adapted to this. It's an amazing reality of the Russian military today that the West has totally missed.
Yeah. And Ray, to you, I want to just pull this up as you talk. This is how the European, especially Western mainstream media, is taking these comments that Scott just elaborated so much on. Kremlin leader signals he won't back down from his maximalist Ukraine war goals. But Ray, take it away.
Well, there you go. Maximalist. They're willing to settle for what they were willing to settle with in April of 2022. Now, of course, facts on the ground show that they can settle for much more and will insist on that. The backdrop of all this, if you look at how Trump is looking at all this, he knows that Biden was poorly served by the intelligence given to him, first and foremost by that woman, Avril Haines, who is the director of national intelligence, who told Biden in December of 2022, don't worry, we've got it made. The Russians are losing on the front. They're not able to replace the weapons that they're just leaving behind them or destroyed. They don't have any indigenous capability to replace those weapons. Don't worry about it. We got it made. She said that publicly. Imagine she must have been telling Biden that privately. Half a year later, in July, Bill Burns, the head of the CIA, told the president to say in Helsinki in a formal address, Putin has already lost. Okay. Now, where did Bill Burns get that information? Well, I traced it back and, he just came from Kiev. And he talked with Zelensky and he said, I have to advise the president on what's going on. And what has it looked? And Zelensky says, we got it made. No problem. Russia has already lost. So that's the backdrop here. Then you have Kellogg telling just 4 months ago, telling Trump, look, we could still win. The Ukrainians are still, Russians are on the back foot. They're losing hundreds of thousands of men. Their economy is falling apart. So now, all of a sudden, about 6 weeks ago, Trump gets the real spiel, okay? He fires Kellogg, marginalizes Rubio, and says, okay, Now, what am I going to do? Just at that same time, Putin has a big press conference, sort of with a kind of a forward post. He's briefed by the chief of staff, Gerasimov. Okay, he's getting fatigued. So he says, "Now, tell me, how are we doing on the front? And is it true that we have two major areas, Pokrovsk and one other, surrounded, so that there are 10,500 Ukrainians that can't get out? Is that true?" Yes, yes, sir. Well, don't kill them all, for God's sake. Please don't destroy them. Give them a chance to surrender. For God, do they know that they have a chance to surrender? They can't get out. Well, yes, they do know that. Okay, well, they didn't pay much heed because, as Scott has said, Zelensky wouldn't give them permission to surrender. So a lot of them trying to get out anyway. Most of those people are getting killed. So what's the point here? At the same little headquarters briefing, Putin says, "No, General Gerasimov, you told me about this new weapon, Burevestnik, but I forget. Tell me, how far did it fly? Oh my God, 14,000 kilometers. And how long did it stay up in it? Oh my, and where can it go? Oh, it's a cruise missile, but in other words, we have not only Oreshnik, we have Burevestnik, and we have Poseidon, which Putin also advertised a couple of weeks later. So the strategic situation is clear. The Russians have the advantage now. I mean, they really do. I mean, we're both going to be dead if they're used, but the Russians have some things that we don't have, okay? Now, the rest of it is that the way things are playing out, demilitarization means either having all these guys surrender or desert, try to get out, or be killed. Now, that's the situation that Trump has kind of recognized now. And he says, okay, well, I'll take the high road and say, let's end this damn thing and prevent 50 to 60,000 more people from being killed when that territory, Trump says this, when that territory will probably be occupied by the Russians anyhow, no matter what we do. So they're all coming together here. And as I say, I'm really shocked at the pace with which all this is happening. In other words, Witkoff and Kushner weren't home a day before they invited the Ukrainians to come back to Miami and tell them what's going on. So, by Christmas or by the turn of the year, we're not going to have a settlement, but we may have something like a framework agreement where finally Ukraine will say, okay, we don't want to become part of NATO anymore. And what will the Europeans do? They'll jumping down, and then they won't be able to do anything because they don't have any money, they don't have any weapons, and they don't have any troops worth speaking of.
Yeah, and Scott, I don't know if you've been following the media coverage of this, but there's constant, especially in relation to Pokrovsk, there's constant Western mainstream media headlines, articles talking about Russia's slow pace on the battlefield. Pokrovsk is not taken. It's all, they frame it as claims. Russia claims Pokrovsk is fallen. They claim they're doing X, Y, Z on the battlefield. Talk about this. How do you react to this? And I'll pull up a video as you're talking of how Reuters covered the Pokrovsk capture. And it's interesting because they don't show very many Russian forces, as you just described how Russia kind of does things. It kind of aligns with how you described Russia's how they fight on the battlefield. But to you, Scott.
First of all, you have to understand that we are in the midst of a giant information warfare operation being waged by Ukraine, but directed by the British. The United States is out of it, but the Western media is no longer plugged. Understand that American mainstream media views Trump as the enemy. So they are totally dependent upon European sources of information, and Ukraine in particular. And what we know, and this is, uncontested reality, that the British put a 48-hour gap, had the Ukrainians put a 48-hour hold on developments on the battlefield. So what was being reported was 2 days old. because they didn't want the reporting to match the Russians. They wanted to create a disparity between the Russian claims and what the West was claiming. So rather than manufacture data, they simply had maps that were 2 days old saying, this is the reality. No, our troops are still here. The Russians were saying, no, we cleared this village out today, but the Ukrainians were saying, no, our reports from Syrskyi is that the troops are still in this village. Well, they were 2 days ago, but they're not now. That's done. That scheme has fallen apart. But that's the thing about Pokrovsk. The idea was to create the impression that the Russians were exaggerating, that the Russians were lying, that the Russians were manufacturing data, that the situation wasn't as bad as it appeared to be. The reality was the situation was very bad. The Russians, I'm not saying that they're 100% accurate 100% of the time. The fog of war is a thing. But again, when this war is all said and done, and I've already done it with the opening, the opening phases of the war, especially after Surovikin came in. You match the Russian claims with the map, and it's sort of exactly what Russia said it was, down to the dead bodies, that the Russians aren't exaggerating. They're not. The one things that the Russians aren't doing is giving you a totally accurate appraisal of their losses. They're very accurate about the Ukrainian losses. With their losses, they're less so. But I interviewed a guy who's very well connected to the Russian Ministry of Defense. And he said, I'm not giving away secrets. It's still something that's closely held. But he said, Ukraine has suffered between 1.5, 1.7 million irretrievable casualties. He said Russia has probably suffered 10%. That number may be adjusted upwards a little bit. So I think the number is 198,000. That's irretrievable. That's dead and permanently disfigured. That's a lot. That's a whole bunch. 4 years, 198,000. But it ain't nothing but the Ukrainians have suffered. But my point is that the Russians are telling the truth about the battlefield state. There is no disconnect. There's no reason for the Russians to be lying. And there's every reason for the Ukrainians to be lying and for the Western media to be lying on behalf of Ukraine. Because when the truth is known, if the full truth was known about the real state of affairs of the Ukrainian military, the war would be over today because the Ukrainian military would surrender because they know they're going to die. Because that's the ultimate outcome here. They're all either going to be surrendered, wounded, or dead. That's it. There's no other outcome. The Ukrainians will not win this war. It's done. All that's left is the killing. And as I said earlier, the last month of the war from World War II is the bloodiest. And there's, a chance Ukrainians will fight hard in the last moments. But this war is over. Pokrovsk proves it. Now, the other thing we see about Pokrovsk is how it was, the center of Ukraine's logistical and command and control, the anchor of the Donbass defenses in this region. Pokrovsk is strategic, da-da-da-da-da. But as it falls, it's just another village. Don't worry about it. It's what, Pokrovsk? What, is that on the map even? Oh, I didn't know we were defending Pokrovsk. I mean, this whole idea of minimizing the consequences, but everybody knows how important Pokrovsk was. And the key element is the brigades that were destroyed defending Pokrovsk. These were the best brigades that Ukraine had. They put them in this fight to try and prevent this. Ukraine has done everything to try and prevent Pokrovsk from falling. Again, another battle that will be studied once this war is over and the records can be fully opened is the way the Ukrainians threw their drone force to create a drone wall to stop the Russians. And it was very effective. I mean, I've spoken to Russians who were caught up in this, and it was not a good day for the Russians who were caught out there. You don't have a good day when the drones are overhead and you got nothing. You're just literally a sitting duck. And there was a moment there, a couple of days, where the Ukrainians made life a living hell for the Russians there. But then they poured everything, though. The problem is they took all of their drone assets. They poured them in. They brought in freshly trained drone control units, and they're out there throwing their drones in. Tens of thousands of drones, 5 drones per Russian soldier. I mean, they were just doing it. And then the Russians brought in their drone units, and the Russians, are able to do surveillance, and they found where all the Ukrainian drone operators were, and then they killed them all with Iskander missiles, with geranium drones, with artillery. They killed them all, and then they pushed them out. The Ukrainians, it was a Pyrrhic victory because some of the best and brightest drone operators that Ukraine had, freshly trained, highly educated people, are dead, and they can't be replaced. And this is just the reality of Pokrovsk. It was a battle that Ukraine knew they couldn't lose, and they did everything. They lied, they cheated, they stole, they threw in their forces, and they lost. And Russia has won. The battle's over, and Ukraine has nothing to show for it but dead bodies.
Yeah, well, Ray, please take it away. Your reaction. Same question.
Well, I just point out that the Russian name for Pokrovsk is Krasnoarmeysk. Krasnoarmey, that's the Red Army. Okay, so, and in just a couple of weeks, the name will be changed, not to protect the innocent, but to brag about the victors. Krasnoarmeysk will be what Pokrovsk has been called. It was a hub. It's gone. As Scott said, the Ukrainians and the West is making light of it, but it's a big deal. The Russians can go to the Dnieper. Whether they will or not doesn't matter. This is not about gains of location or territory. It's about getting rid of, demilitarizing. That means getting rid of Ukrainian army troops. Now, the Russians are doing that. They have cauldrons. So what bothers me, and what I made a little note here to mention, is that I don't know what the British, who are usually the authors of false flag operations, of course, the Poles and the others will, Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians will cooperate, but I don't know what's in their arsenal that they could use now to disrupt what's going on. I guess I just have to say that since I don't know what's in the arsenal, maybe other people don't either. And what scares me is that they could mount a major attack having to do with a nuclear power station or something like that to derail this whole thing, if they could. And that's what bothers me, because they have every incentive to do that now. The British have escaped lots of blame from the Russians. The Russians blame them, but they have not retaliated against them until now. And if the Russians do retaliate against a NATO ally, I think the British will be the head of the line. And, I'm Irish, so I'm a little bit prejudiced, but Jeffrey Sachs is not Irish, he's Jewish. And he says that the British are responsible for just about every evil that's happened in the world for the last several centuries. And if you look at things, you can kind of realize why he says that. And he, of course, is more highly educated professionally than I am.
Yeah, and Scott, before, just in case you get taken away by your responsibilities. Yeah, the knock at the door. I wanted both of your comments on this, but I will first you, Scott. It's interesting the tone that people like Mark Rutte are taking in response to these battlefield woes for Ukraine. Here's just a quick comment where he's literally mocking Vladimir Putin for something very specific.
I'm not going to react to every thing Putin is saying. We have seen him in military clothes, dressed like a soldier at the front, but not at the front. It was quite far from the front the day before yesterday. Well, the peace talks are ongoing. That's good, but at the same time we have to make sure that whilst they take place, and we are not sure when they will end, that Ukraine is in the strongest possible position to keep the fight going, to fight back against the Russians, but also in the strongest possible position when peace talks really get to a point where they sit at the table.
Doesn't sound like someone who's very enthusiastic about peace, Scott. Take it away. React to this, because the mocking tone also is pretty incredible given the reality.
I mean, Mark Rutte, when he was selected to be the Secretary General of NATO, I said at the time that he will probably be the last Secretary General of NATO. NATO can't survive him for any number of reasons, one of which is his mouth, which is attached to his brain, which is non-functioning. This is a man who knows nothing of military art. Remember when he was in the Dutch government, I think he brought about, the destruction of the Dutch military and the Dutch economy. He's a failed politician, but he's a compliant tool. He was supposed to be a compliant tool of the United States. That's why he was selected, because under the Biden administration, Rutte would say all the things that the Biden administration wanted him to say to sustain this conflict, which was the policy of the United States. But now Rutte is out of touch, out of reality, and he's literally an actor this is like a TV show where the production company has just fired the script writers. There's nobody writing the script. And so Rutte's now lights, camera, action, called to come out, and he's reading from an old script. He doesn't know what to say. He doesn't know what to think because he can't think. He doesn't have any original thought. There's no substance behind anything he does or says. So he goes for the cheap insults. I mean, if he wants to mock Vladimir Putin for wearing a uniform, let him. I mean, I don't think Putin lost any sleep over that. I can't imagine that Putin became so fundamentally depressed that he rolled up into a ball in the back of the airplane and said, I can't get off in India. Tell Modi I can't do it. Rutte, I wore a uniform and I was not near the front line. I'm so bad. I've been called out. Oh, my God. I don't think Putin gives a rat's you-know-what about anything Rutte says or anything anybody in NATO. As I said, Europe has nullified itself in terms of its relevance. The nothing that Rutte said resonates anywhere except in Rutte's little empty echoed head. Tomorrow he'll say something equally as stupid. He'll say something stupid next week, and it'll go on and on and on. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian army will be destroyed piecemeal. And there's not a damn thing Rutte can do to stop that from happening. There's no more equipment that NATO can provide. There's nothing NATO can do. They can sit there and have meetings and talk about how they're going to build 800,000 strong rapid reaction force. That isn't, it's a figment of their imagination. NATO has no economy capable of doing that. They have no defense industry capable of doing that. They don't have a population willing to do that. Germany did a poll. If Germany was invaded, what percentage of the German male population would be willing to fight and die to defend Germany? 16%. That's if Germany was invaded. Now, what would happen if Germany decided to invade people? What percentage of the German male population would be willing to fight and die in that enterprise? You won't find anybody in Europe willing to line up for this. This is why they're talking about mass conscription now. This is their new strategy, because they know you can't assemble a volunteer army of that size because nobody's going to sign up. Nobody believes in this crap. So now they're talking about mass conscription, and that'll just lead to mass demonstrations in the street and the rapid collapse of the political and economic order that is already in full-scale free-fall mode. This is the end of Europe. I hate to say it. I used to live in Europe. I traveled around Europe. I loved the old Europe. It was a lot of fun to be in. European people were, but they have morphed into something that is a perversion of what Europe should be. They want to be something like the United States, sort of a European extension of American hegemony. They don't have the cojones to pull it off. I'm sorry to say, but the reason why America is the strongest nation in the world, or at least was, is that we had a bunch of red-blooded boys in Missouri and Mississippi that we hung down in college fraternity basements and threw beer and red meat at them. These were animals ready to go out and do animalistic things. That's what we do. I'm not proud of it. I'm just saying that's the reality. Europeans aren't animals. They're civilized people. They're educated people. They're erudite, but they're not that educated anymore. They're really ignorant about the world they live in, and they forgot who they are. They forgot what they are. They forgot everything. They mean nothing. What is a European? Somebody find me a definition of what a European is. I know what a German is. I know what an Italian is. I know what a French person is. What is a European? It doesn't exist. It's a figment of their collective imagination. And as a result, because they don't know who they are, they don't stand for anything, they are nothing. And this is the reality. And Rutte is a living example of that. What is NATO without the United States? Nothing. What is the European Union without America backing? Nothing. It is a fundamentally flawed concept whose time is up. History is over. Goodbye, farewell, auf Wiedersehen, goodbye.
Right. Ray, certainly you can react, and Scott, if you get the knock at the door, you can head out. No problem.
Well, in defense of Mark Rutte, I wrote a thing that is now on Consortium News this morning, saying that he did his best to keep, I don't know what the Dutch expression is, but the British say keep a stiff upper lip, right? He explained it doesn't matter that the Secretary of State from the United States is not there. No. He must be busy doing. He's just not here, but that doesn't matter. And he's trying to sort of tell people, look, everything's going to be okay. This is, I think, an interesting example of the caliber of people that the United States has pushed up into leadership roles in NATO, Secretary General. Now, it's not just Rutte. Let me go back to right before the Iraq War. A fellow named Anders Fogh Rasmussen from Denmark had been Secretary of General of NATO, and he said just a week or two before the war, we don't believe that Iraq has weapons of mass destruction. We know they do. Right? Okay. So that was him. Then we have people like, Stoltenberg, the Norwegian. Okay. Now, he was the one that Rutte replaced. Stoltenberg made a faux pas wrong. Okay. A big faux pas before the EU Parliament more than 2 years ago, when he said, look, we have to be honest. The Russians came to us and they said, look, no Ukraine in NATO. You keep trying to get Ukraine in NATO, we will have to invade Ukraine. You understand? And we said, no. And so he invaded NATO. And instead of no enlargement, we got Sweden, we got Finland. So look, Putin lost because we got two, and maybe Ukraine. That's the caliber of leadership. This was a time when at least 500,000 youth from Ukraine had been killed or dismembered or really mortally wounded, or wounded anyway, by that time of the war. So this Rutte is just another guy that will do what the U.S. tells him to do, except the U.S. doesn't tell him anymore. And Rutte is trying to make the best of it. But as I said before, the cardinal thing about NATO, which should have been disbanded as soon as the Soviet Union fell apart, but wasn't. The thing about NATO was the first Secretary General of NATO knew which end was up. And the first thing he said, the purpose of NATO is keep the United States in. Now, that purpose has been foiled by United States ineptitude. NATO is no more in any functional way. And what Scott has said about its military capabilities is absolutely true. How long will it take European leaders to realize this? I imagine they have too much personal stake in this. Their governments will fall. It will probably take them several more months before they concede that this is reality and the game has changed. And NATO is a vestigial organ, sort of like wisdom teeth, right? Except there's less wisdom in NATO than there is in wisdom teeth.
I think it was Lord Hastings, I think, the first Secretary General of NATO, and it was what is the purpose of NATO? To keep the Americans in, keep the Germans down, and keep the Russians out.
Right.
And if you take a look, I mean, first of all, the Americans are out. Germany, it's not, NATO's not keeping Germany. Germany's keeping itself down. I mean, I'll make a prediction, probably a silly prediction, but if Germany keeps going the way they're going, I think you may see Germany actually fracture into two separate nation states, East and West. They're fundamentally different states as it is. There's a lot of resentment in the East towards the West about what happened after German unification. And now if they politically isolate Alternative for Deutschland, which is very popular in the Eastern parts, you may see a lot of Germans just cease to recognize the viability of a unified German state. And if I were the Russians, I'd be pushing for that very, very hard. But that's the Russian business, not my business. But the last one is keep the Russians out. Russia just kicked the crap out of NATO. And Russia will be in Europe, not occupied militarily. But look at the stupidity again of Europe. They've collapsed their economy, and now they just passed a law that said we will be totally free of Russian energy. Yay! You know, that's like a starving person saying, "And we have cut off all connection with the farms." Well, how are you going to eat? How is Europe going to rebuild its economy? They will need Russian energy, and Russian energy will come back with a vengeance. This is part of the whole security thing that's being worked out right now between Trump and Putin. This whole there's a key aspect to this negotiation, which is what about security frameworks? And the key element of security frameworks is economic interoperability. And the United States is going to play a very important role in ensuring economic interoperability between Europe and Russia, because if they can thrive together, it's the exact opposite track that the United States have been doing for many years, where they wanted to isolate Russia from Europe. But I think now the new thinking is the best way to make Russia and Europe peacefully coexist is to increase the level of cooperation between the two. But this will be a different cooperation, because European cooperation with Russia was defined by the decade of the 90s, where Europe went in as sort of an occupying power, a colonial power, taking charge of a Russian economy that had collapsed. The Russian economy today is kicking some serious ass. They've become rather independent. They don't need Europe. Europe will need Russian energy. So I think you're going to be looking at a totally different relationship dynamic taking place. But the Russians are in. So NATO has failed across the board. It is an absolute disaster of an organization. And I say this, somebody whose brother-in-law is a big player in the NATO hierarchy. This is a man who, was the Luxembourg ambassador to NATO, a man who went on to be the Luxembourg deputy minister of defense and head of the Luxembourg intelligence service, and today plays a major role in the NATO hierarchy. I mean, I'm sorry, but you're going to be unemployed pretty soon, because NATO is finished, done. You bought into you bought a ticket on the Titanic. It's over. And I can't shed any tears. I used to like NATO. When I was in the Marine Corps, NATO was a thing. Part of the mission of my unit was to reinforce, Denmark to come in and be part of the American force that would come in to protect the isthmus from any Soviet advance. And we spent a lot of time preparing to die in Denmark and in the fields of northern Germany, because that was our fate if we got thrown into that fight. But thank God we didn't have to do it. But back then, I believed in the NATO mission, and I supported everything we did. But NATO has no mission today. It's not only counterproductive and counterintuitive to peace, but it's also basically it's going to bring around the rapid collapse of Europe. The longer Europe ties itself to this NATO ship, the worse things are going to be for Europe. The sooner Europe can divorce itself from NATO, the sooner Europe can begin the path of recovery.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, there's something rotten in Denmark, and it's not only dead Marines. There's something rotten throughout Europe. And, when you talk about Germany, I'd like to pick up on that, Scott. It is hopelessly divided right now. Would the Russians like to see Germany divided? I imagine they'd like to have that back. Think back to February 1st, 1990, when that smart lawyer from Texas, what was his name? James
Baker.
Baker. So it comes there on dispatch from George H.W. Bush, and he says, "Hey, I got a deal for you. You accept a reunited Germany." Now, God, I was alive during all of World War II, right? And just the idea of a reunited Germany sent the shivers up my spine. You can imagine Gorbachev, Shevardnadze, from a country that lost 27 million citizens, how they reacted to that. They said, well, okay, what's the pro? This is a big quid. That's a, sour. Well, the pro is well, we won't move NATO 1 inch to the east. So, Gorbachev, Shevardnadze, really with hoping that the U.S. would bail them out economically. They saw that people like Jeffrey Sachs had bailed out Poland, and they hoped that we would help them and say, all right, well, okay, we did. Okay. Now, we know that's all embedded in all these documents of the time, February 1st, 1990. Now, wouldn't it be ironic? Wouldn't it be poetic justice that after the impact of all this NATO expansion, including particularly the reach out to Ukraine, that it would end up ultimately as a side effect that Germany would be divided again? There's lots to be said for this kind of division. I'm not advocating it, but wouldn't it be ironic to see Germany divided again? And I don't know how many people would shed tears on either side of what used to have been the Iron Curtain.
Right. Hey, Scott, while you're here, I did have a question I did not ask earlier. Given all of this big bad wolf identity crisis that Europe is in right now, why is it from a crass, like just straight up military perspective, why would an entity like NATO threaten preemptive strikes on Russia, yet not have air defenses against a country that has an missile arsenal that's the best in the world, essentially? What is with that? I mean, I'm just curious on your reaction to this.
It's actually a cry for help, an acknowledgement of their irrelevance. I think NATO is looking at the collapse of the NATO experiment, or in Ukraine. And this was very much a NATO experiment. Remember, it was NATO that set up training bases in Western Ukraine in 2015. By 2016, they were putting out slides. They were American bases, but NATO trainers bragging about how they were training 550 Ukrainians a month to go eastward and kill Russians in the Donbass, bragging about it. They did a graphic that showed it. This has always been a U.S. and NATO-driven effort to turn Ukraine into, a poison thorn in the side of Russia to help facilitate the collapse of the Russian Federation. This is what NATO has been seeking to do forever. And then they politically and economically, doubled down after the SMO. They made this an existential struggle. The goal was to strategically defeat Russia. Putin has said that. They want to just strategically defeat us. It's an existential fight, but NATO has gone all in, meaning that NATO has made it such that if they don't strategically defeat Russia, that is a strategic defeat for NATO. NATO can't recover from this loss. And so what you have now is this Italian admiral and the rest of NATO waking up to the fact that they have lost. And so how do you recover from this? How do you motivate? You're impotent. And you can't do anything. And so you hypothesize, we may have to launch a preemptive strike against Russia to threaten that's what you can't do. But then he just, like I said, you just parse it out, because I was very interested in the headlines when I read that. He said, what? Kind of thing. But then I went and read his statement. I said, oh, he said nothing, because he acknowledges that they can't do it. He said, we're going to do a preemptive strike, but we can't. There'd be political problems, like nobody would agree to this. And there would be, legal issues, like it's a violation of the law of war and international law. There are practical issues, because we don't know where the troops would come from, on whose authority they would operate, who would give them permission to do this, where that permission would come from. We don't know any of that. Maybe we could do cyber preemption, because we're worried about cyber. Well, wait a minute. You just threatened preemptive strike. I'm thinking guerrilla package, Gulf War, 450 aircraft zooming in like we did against Iraq. No. You want to do a cyber attack with what? Because the greatest cyber superpower outside of Russia and China is the United States. And we're not going to be part of that. You don't have the NSA and Cyber Command playing this game. So who's going to do? GCHQ? They're nothing. The Dutch, they got limited capabilities, but they all ride on American coattails. They all use American. We don't need to get into it too much here, but the hacking tools and the methodologies and all that, sort of what we do for a living. We control all this stuff. They don't. And they want to launch a preemptive strike against Russia, who I can guarantee you with almost 100% certainty that Russia's penetrated the vast majority of these little cyber services that the Europeans have. And the Russians know exactly what they're doing. The Russians are very clever. And the idea that Russia would allow itself to be exposed to a kind of cyber preemption from a European proxy is ludicrous. So this is just, again, a statement of impotence. This is, I don't want to be crude, but, this is like an 80-year-old man at the beach looking at the hot 20-year-old women fantasizing. Oh, I'm sorry, Ray.
Careful.
I'll say 60-year-old man at the beach looking at the hot 20-year-old women fantasizing about what he thought he could. Dude, it's over. I mean, you can think about it all you want to, but, no. And this is NATO right now. It's just an impotent old fool pretending that he's still in the game.
Let me, well, you're still here, Scott. I know that somebody's going to knock on your door. Not the FBI this time, hopefully.
Hopefully not the FBI.
But the big issue, what I consider the litmus test, Putin, September 22nd. Look, New START is expiring on February 5. There's no hope that we can revive it or fix it. It's over. We propose that we Russians adhere to the quantitative limits of that New START treaty for another year, as well as if you're willing to do the same, Mr. Trump. A couple of weeks later, some press person asked Trump about this. He says, "Oh, it sounds like a good idea to me." And the Russians have been saying, "Please, something a little bit more official, please. Can we have a response?" Now, my point is simply, this is big deal, okay? Now, the Russians will read Trump's reaction in a very important way. If he is unable to deliver on this very simple matter, okay, then I think the Russians will have to assume that Trump is not in a position to do much of anything. And doverai no proverai, trust but verify, man. That verification thing on any Ukrainian resolution will have to be double safe, fail safe. So what do you think, Scott? You're much closer to the New START provisions and the fact. What do you think about that?
Well, as you know, Ray, I went to Russia with some great expectations of being able to engage in a meaningful fashion with the highest levels of the Russian government about issues pertaining to arms control and nuclear disarmament. My problem, again, is the timing of history, that while there were indications that there would be receptive to this kind of engagement, somewhere around October 26th, 28th, Witkoff and Dmitriev began this process that has led to what it is now. And, unspoken in this is that part of the 28-point peace plan, if you look at it, is inclusive of New START, and that this has been a conversation that is taking place between the Russians and the United States. Understand that the New START treaty as it exists cannot be extended. There's no provision in it for an extension. Vladimir Putin has offered a voluntary moratorium until which time something new can be negotiated. There won't be a New START treaty negotiated because once you go down that route, how do you bring in Burevestnik? How do you bring in Poseidon? How do you factor in anti-ballistic missile? All the concerns come in. So what appears to be in the works right now is they will simply just print out a new copy of the New START treaty, put a new date on it, and say, let's sign this one. Maybe 3 years, give ourselves 3 to buy time. There is some dialogue taking place, but because of the sensitivity of this, the Russians put a moratorium on discussion. It was clear when interviews that I had been told were going to happen weren't happening. People weren't available, but what it really became clear. First of all, I did put in a proposal about INF and discussion that made it to the highest levels in Russia. You can use your imagination what that means, who considered it and came back with now is not the time. Not a no, but just a firm now is not the time. Me being who I am, I never take no for an answer. So I I engaged with the Valdai Club, and we were going to have a big panel to talk about nuclear disarmament, etc. And the word came down from high up that it was, we like Scott Ritter, but the nuclear issue is not for the Valdai Club to discuss. Nobody will talk about this at this time. Mm-hmm. The Russians just aren't talking nuclear right now. It's not an issue for public discourse. The Russian government has put the kibosh on that because they're engaged in some very sensitive negotiations with the United States on this very issue. Mm-hmm. And you have to be careful because, again, if we talk about renegotiation of New START, the Golden Dome comes into play. That's a killer. Or Oreshnik and Dark Eagle come into play. That's a killer. The only way you keep these caps going in a treaty framework is literally to print out New START, put a new date on it and say, yeah, this treaty is now good for 3 years or 5 years or something like that. That buys time for, reality checks and to talk about ABM in a non-pressured environment. Maybe when it becomes apparent that the United States can't afford the Golden Dome, that the technologies don't work, et cetera. INF, can we even deploy Dark Eagle? Is it a viable weapon system? If we do we talk about, going back to the zero option? Remember, it took the Russians, the Soviets deploying SS-20s and America responding with Pershing 2s to get to zero. So can we go back to zero on INF? But then there's the big kicker, China. China just published a white paper on arms control. Right. Fascinating what they wrote there. Because what the Chinese basically said is, don't accuse us of being unstable. You guys have the largest nuclear arsenals in the world. And as we speak, you, the Russians, are upgrading everything. And you, the Americans, are threatening about expanding. And now you're pointing the finger at us because we look at the threats made by America and we seek to modestly upgrade our capabilities so we have survivability. But the Chinese have made it clear that the onus on meaningful global nuclear disarmament is on Russia and the United States to bring their arsenals under control. Yeah. And that is a very important signal to both the United States and Russia that you probably need to fire up the printer, print out a new copy of New START, put a new date on it, and then buy time so we can have these kind of very comprehensive discussions. But it has been made clear by the Russians, they're not ready to have these discussions in public right now. It is literally an extraordinarily destabilizing environment we have right now because the treaty's dead. New START is gone. And the extension that Putin's offered cannot survive Golden Dome and INF. Right. And so the Russians, this is a very delicate time for them. And they have basically said, Ritter, thank you very much. Thanks for coming in, playing the game, boss. We really appreciate your effort. But no, we're not talking nuclear with you or anybody right now because we're talking with the only people that count, and that's the Trump administration. So that's where things stand right now, in my opinion. Okay. Now, Scott, just a follow-up question. Go ahead. Get one follow-up question?
Of course.
Yeah. You're Raymond Governor, you can have 50.
So do you agree? Well, I know you would think that these quiet discussions going on are a good thing. Let's say they come up with an agreement to do the kind of thing you suggest, just print out a new START treaty, the way the old one was. Do you think that Trump could countenance that kind of thing? Or will the Iron Dome or Golden Dome or will I've seen these kinds of steps squashed by the military-industrial complex going back to Reykjavik, right? There have been lots of times where even Reagan wanted to do away with nuclear weapons, but he went to his team and then you don't have your Golden Dome. You don't have your Star Wars, okay? So I know this is hard to predict, but what do you think?
Well, that's why I think that printing out is the only option, because understand this. If New START, this might be the knock at the door. New START wouldn't be, if we had 5 years left on it, Golden Dome wouldn't kill New START. New START exists no matter what. New START exists even with the demise of the INF Treaty. So by reprinting it, it's the only way to go forward. There's no other option. And I think Trump could sell New START to the Senate. He couldn't sell a new treaty that prevented Golden Dome and prevented INF. That's too bold of an arms control experiment at this time. So I think this is the only way to go forward. But that's just my speculation right now. And unfortunately, I do have to go now because the dogs are going to go absolutely bananas.
All right.
Ray, always an honor and privilege to be in with you. Danny, thanks for bringing us together.
Of course.
And
I'll be in touch with you soon.
Make sure it's not the FBI.
Well, freeze, hands up. Okay. See you guys.
See you soon. Ray, we can actually any final comments from you about what we've discussed before we head out of here?
Well, just a general impression that there's a lot of negativism going around about what Putin is really after, and how Trump would kowtow to him. Putin is giving Trump the benefit of the doubt. As recently as 2 hours ago, when he's making this speech, where was he? I forget now. Anyhow, Putin is
India. He's in India, correct?
Is India, right? Of course.
Right.
Yeah. So the last half of his interview is all devoted to all this stuff that's going on. So I think that Putin is making bending over backwards to read the best into Trump's intentions. He keeps saying Trump has a lot of resistance, but his heart's in the right place, and I truly believe that he wants to stop the killing. Now, politically, and this is not my specialty, domestic politics, but Trump has set himself up saying, look, this is not my war. It's Biden's war. I want to end it. Sure, we'll do a compromise with the Russians and we'll talk to them and so forth. So I think that Putin sees this now as getting back onto the track that they started out in Alaska. And the big thing is that, if I haven't said this before, two things in Alaska. One, no immediate ceasefire. Trump agreed to that. And then he also agreed not to let the Ukrainians and the Europeans sabotage progress forward. And then Trump did one of his zigzags and let them do precisely that, until he realized that he was being misled. The Ukrainians had no chance to win. And then he put his sensible people, Witkoff and his son-in-law, into play, told Rubio, go talk with Kellogg, have fun with Rice Krispies or whatever. And so there is a chance now for progress forward. Things are going at a much rapider pace than I would have expected. I've written about this several times on consortiumnews.com for those who are interested. And I see more hope now that the Europeans and the Ukrainians themselves have been marginalized, than I have 2 weeks ago for sure. But I've always had this idea that, and this is the main point, that Russian priorities lie in creating a more decent relationship with the United States. Okay. Now, think about that. Everything else is secondary. Ukraine? Yeah. Well, let's say that, what if the United States bombed Iran right at Russia's doorstep? Secondary. How do I know that? The Russians said so. Okay. So if you read what they say and then you see how they act, everything else is secondary. They're winning in Ukraine. There's no reason to rush. They will take advantage of Trump's impulse to get things done now. Partly, I think, again, smile if you will, but part of it, the Nobel, he wants the Nobel Peace Prize. And so I see more hope now than ever before. I don't like people dismissing these things out of hand, like, dead on arrival and all this kind of stuff. I think this is of such importance that you don't want to fall in league with the real people who wish everything ill, the John Boltons and the Lindsey Grahams and all those kinds of people. So that's my little spiel. I see more hope, and I think it's not a forlorn hope. I think Putin will play this straight. And the best thing, of course, is we have his caution. And one reason he wants a more decent relationship with the U.S. is not so much to get the embassy properties back that Obama stole from him. No. It's to make sure that they have the kind of relationship that Trump, however zigzaggish he is never prompted to put his fingers on the auto pen or the nuclear codes like Biden's people came near to doing back at the last couple of months of their administration. That was really bad. It's better now. We should rejoice in that and look for some sort of framework agreement by the end of the year, which would please Trump no end. And I think if it's the right terms, it would please Putin as well. Thanks, Danny, for giving me a chance.
Of course, of course. Well, I'll just say this, and here's your article on Consortium News. I think everyone in the holiday season, if there's any media publication you should be giving to, this is one of them, truly independent, and they publish guys like Ray and so many others, Scott, John Kiriakou, I mean, and of course, Joe Lawyer is great. He's been on this show. But, you know, even for me, I am not gangbusters about U.S. foreign policy. I'm going to use that outdated term. You know, Donald Trump is not a peacenik, so to speak, in my assessment, but every U.S. president needs a foreign policy signature achievement. And despite the fact that Trump talks about, I have like a million peace deals here and there, whether you think that's the truth or not the truth or distortions, I tend to fall into that league. But the fact of the matter is, every U.S. president needs something that they can say, this is what I've accomplished. This is why I was a legitimate president. And if we look at the polling numbers, the popularity, the how Trump is being perceived on all the other things, it's not good right now. So Donald Trump needs a win, and that, so in my assessment, is a huge reason too why this is being pushed forward. You know, regardless of whatever we may think of Trump or the process or the where the U.S. is in terms of its trustworthiness, it doesn't matter. What matters is that there's a lot of push factors right at the back of Donald Trump's administration.
Yeah,
that's what I think.
There's a way that you can approach this, I think, by distinguishing things like Gaza, where Trump is enabling genocide,
right,
forced starvation, the kind of thing I never thought that my country would support, arm. I never thought that. My whatever. Okay. So can you distinguish that kind of gross immorality or the gross immorality of shooting up fishermen in the Caribbean or off in the Pacific? So can you distinguish that from what he's trying to do on Ukraine? Well, if you're a realpolitik guy, if you belong to the John Mearsheimer school of realism, and you see that progress could be made in one area, well, you go for it. And, you know, to say that this would condone what Russia did in invading Ukraine, that betrays a lack of understanding of why Russia went in there and why John Mearsheimer himself warned that precisely this would happen. Ukraine would be destroyed. His word, he said that 11 years ago, Ukraine would be destroyed if it kept trying to get into NATO. And now John has been proven right. So what I'm saying here is that we keep our eye on the prize here, and there can be several prizes, and we can get kind of sort of exclude the really bad stuff and give Trump, as Putin is doing, the benefit of the doubt on Ukraine, and at least we could stop the killing there, and maybe good sense would prevail. We could stop the killing in Gaza.
Yeah, or the future killing that might happen in Venezuela or elsewhere. I mean, I think it's always an opportunity. That's how I always look at it. People in the U.S. push your government to do what is necessary, and if it can't do it, find a way to force it to happen. That's always my. That's how people who are engaged politically, that's how I believe they should behave if they really, truly want to see peace. But Ray, this was great. I want to make sure that everybody knows that your website is in the video description where they can check out your work. I also, Scott's Substack is also there where you can support him and you can check out his work as well.
Yeah. Danny, let me interrupt for one thing. It's not really a self-promotion thing, but Trump is going to be facing Russiagate 2.0 now. Okay. People who are aware of what happened in Russiagate, where the deep state, the media, and the Democratic Party disabled Trump from being able to achieve anything in terms of a better relationship with Russia during those 4 years that he was president. So what am I saying here? I'm saying that people need to be educated. I've done a lot of work on this, and there are two long things on my website now, raymcgovern.com. One is a history of how this evolved in such a way that Putin had no choice, no other choice. And the other one is how Americans have been warned not to use brainwash. Okay, have they been conditioned to believing that Putin and the Russians are completely evil? I address that as well in another thing that's on raymcgovern.com. So I've used this stuff that I've done in the past, but it's still relevant because people are blissfully unaware of what the real situation is because of the major media. And that's why I appreciate so much being on your show, Danny, because lots of people are watching us. And at least maybe we can encourage them to go out and tell their neighbors that it's not what you read in the mainstream media.
Yeah, and it really does matter. All right. So everyone can find Scott and Ray's work in the video description. All the places to support this channel, also their Patreon, Substack, PayPal, Buy Me a Coffee, so much more. But the best thing you can do, it's free. And for everyone who's still here, it says about 3,700 of you, hit that like button before you go, because that is how YouTube works. That's how it operates. If you liked what you heard, if you support this kind of work, if you hit the like button, you also leave a comment too. That also boosts engagement. Then YouTube says, wow, people really like this show. Other people should watch it. So do that as you go. It's been a great show today, Ray. I want to just acknowledge all the super chats here before I go, and I want to apologize to Diana. We didn't get to ask your question, but Scott will be back. What's the difference between UN versus NATO versus UN Army? Well, that's a really big question we'll have to get to another time, Diana. Please do submit it to me even privately if you want, so I make sure to ask it of him next time. Thanks to all the moderators who were here today, and thanks to everyone, of course, for watching. And until next time, I'll be back, I think, on Saturday night, and I'll announce with who. I think it'll be Ben Norton on Saturday night. So be there. Take care. See you then. Bye-bye.